Here's a solution from the last tutorial where we created an emoji converter. Now, so far we've been writing all our code right here in app.py, but as our programs grow, we need a better way to organize our code. We need to break up our code into smaller, more manageable, and more maintainable chunks, which we call functions. So a function is a container for a few lines of code that perform a specific task. For example, you have learned about a few of the built-in functions in Python like print and input. Each of these functions have a purpose. They know how to perform a specific task. So when building large, complex programs, we should break up our code into smaller, reusable chunks, which we call functions, to better organize our code. And that's what I'm going to show you in this tutorial. So let's write a simple program for printing a greeting message. So we're going to do a print, hi there, and let's add another message, welcome aboard. So here we have a simple program with only 2 lines of code. Now let's say these 2 lines, potentially we're going to need them in other programs. So we can put them in a function that we can reuse. Let me show you how to do that. So we start typing out def, that is a reserved keyword in Python, and it's short for define. When Python interpreter sees this, it knows that we're defining a function. Next, we need to give our function a name. Let's say greet underline user. So all the best practices you learn about naming your variables also apply here, which means you should name your functions with lowercase characters. If there are multiple words, you need to separate them using an underscore. And you should always use meaningful and descriptive names for your functions. So here we're defining a function called greetUser. After that, we need to add parentheses followed by a colon. Now, you know that whenever we add a colon at the end of a line, we're telling Python that we're defining a block of code. So when we press enter, the next line is indented. Now, any code that we write here will belong to this function. So I'm going to move these 2 lines, these 2 print statements inside of our function. We can simply press tab to indent them. Beautiful. Also, let's remove this extra line break. That is better. So these 2 lines now are part of our greet user function. So whenever we call this function, these 2 lines will be executed. Okay. Now let's remove indentation. So here we are outside of our function. Let's do a print statement and print start. After that, let's call our function. So greet user. And finally, let's do another print statement and print finish. Now we have this little warning here, this underline. If you hover your mouse over this line, this tooltip is telling you that we should add 2 blank lines after function definition. This is coming from PEP 8, which is a document that defines the best practices for formatting our code. We'll look at that in the future. So for now, to make PyCharm happy, let's add an extra line break after this function. So whenever we define a function, we need to add 2 line breaks after. Okay. So now let's run our program and see what happens. All right. So we get 4 messages on the terminal. First, we get the start message. Then we get the messages coming from our greet function. So hi there and welcome aboard. And finally, we see the finish message. So let me explain the flow of our program. When Python runs this code, it doesn't actually print these 2 messages on the terminal because these lines of code are inside of this function. So they will only get executed if we call this function. If we don't call this function, these lines will not get executed. Okay? So the execution of our program actually starts here. The first message that we see on the terminal is the start message. After that, Python sees that we're calling the greet function. So it will jump over here and then execute these 2 lines. Then it will jump outside of this function and continue the normal execution of our program. So it will print the finish message on the terminal. So this is how functions work. Also note that the order of this code matters. So here we're calling the greet function after we have defined it. If you try to call it before you define it, you will see an error. For example, if we call the greet user function right here, see, we immediately get this red underline, which says unresolved reference greet user, which basically means Python doesn't know what is this greet user. It's not defined anywhere. So we always define our functions first and then call them.